Warning. This chapter contains adult content, so I've skipped that part and rewritten it as best I can. If you wish to read the chapter in its entirety, please visit the link in the descriptions. Ocular by Iniquity. Chapter 13. He awoke in the deep freezing darkness and still chasing the dream he had been having. He had been having a dream about Lawrence. They had been in a monstrously comfortable bed as if they were royalty, and there had been a brilliant fire in the grate, and Lawrence had been telling him that he did want Alexander to submit. He had been pressing his body against Alexander's, and they had both been nude, and Alexander could not breathe from the heat of it, and he could not resist or stop himself from kissing and touching Lawrence. Lawrence was here in the dark, but they could not take such risks again. But Lawrence had crawled into his bed, curled up around him, and gone to sleep. But they could be hanged. But his blood was thrumming like a war drum. Lawrence was right next to him, delicate and asleep. Lawrence was fully dressed. He could feel the buttons and the cuffs against his skin, because of course only an idiot undressed in this cold for longer than it took to jump in a river to wash off the grime. Alexander could not help but think of his dream. Lawrence's pink, wet mouth, Lawrence's strong, capable hands, Lawrence's muscular chest. He was weak, he was sinful and immoral, a bastard of no standing, and a man with nothing to leave behind. The camp was quiet, and the night would mask their sins. He nodded to no one. He did not suspect they would be interrupted given the silence around them and the absolute darkness of their tent. He did not need light to see Lawrence to know where the other man was. He could feel his skin all around. He could not stop himself. His desire was a wave, sweeping up any doubts, disagreements, or hesitations like storm debris. It surged upon him so suddenly and so completely that he could consider no other course of action. He was not a man to hesitate or disguise his ideals. The more dramatic or revolutionary the action was to be, the more passionately he needed to pursue it. He could not act as if he could be resisted. He had to consume the moment and step forward into the future that he shaped. He pressed a kiss to chapped lips. Another. A third, more insistent. Rumbled Lawrence. My Lawrence, he whispered, and he drew a hand up the man's arm. He knew the knots well enough to unwrap his cravat without seeing it. He nipped at the skin there. His favorite. Alexander, Lawrence breathed. He could feel the man's eyes on him. What are you doing? John. Alexander suddenly found himself breathless. His skin burned, not with the fever, but with a new kind of heat. He was trying not to become swept up in it, but it was a difficult task. Words, his main weapon, seemed worthless here. He could only make headway with actions. Even so. I had a marvelous dream. We were in a real bed and there was a fireplace, and we were nude, and you were hovering over me, telling me to submit. I couldn't stop looking at you, at your body, and as much as I wanted to consume you, I knew I couldn't. You were my king and I your vassal. Hamilton, this... I will speak frankly, he said, his voice a sharp, harsh whisper. Do you desire me, my love? He had to know. He could not convince his Lawrence to take this course of action with anything other than the overwhelming strength of his conviction. He would use only the clear, obvious truth. He would ask only the most direct of questions. He already knew that such a thing was more dangerous than a battle and could create a deeper, more lasting scar than a gunshot. But he could not let the fear of being harmed stop him. He had to be willing to die for this cause, as much as any other thing he believed. If he did not acknowledge the terrible possibility that lingered so close, there was no chance for it to take shape in reality. He ignored the sharp twist of doubt, because that was the only way to press forward. He could do nothing but press forward. He had been born to march. Do not mince words, he said, trying to stop the dangerous hot spark of lust in his bones from catching fire. If you do not wish this, I will retreat. But I will not lie to you that there is little I desire more than to ravish you at this very moment. I know the law. I know what this is. I accept I will know forever in my heart that I am a godless sodomite. But that is meaningless. It is nothing in comparison to the joy it would bring me and to the pleasure I wish to bring to you. If we were not trapped in this despicable cold, I would tear your clothes from you in attempt to have you speechless with ecstasy. As it is, I am certain I am capable enough." There was a suffocating silence. Alexander did not think of the terrible endings. He did not think of the gallows. He did not think of... "You have infected me with this carnal urge, and I cannot deny that I want," Lawrence said at last, smashing his fear like glass. Alexander opened his mouth to say something, but then Lawrence continued. "When you kiss me, my heart burns. Your touch in this manner makes my skin sing. I cannot deny that I want for you, and more now than I have ever before, to think of us in this dream." For a moment there was nothing but the sound of their breathing. "Will God smite us?" "Certainly we deserve at least this, when we have nothing else," Alexander replied, his whisper harsh, reaching and finding Lawrence's face. Lawrence scooted closer until he could feel the man's panting breath against his lips, and their legs had tangled. "We have risked our lives to fight for liberty and freedom, and the greater improvement of man. We have given all our material belongings and been left with barely anything, no food, no warmth. Our friends have died by bullet, bayonet, and fever. How can God deprive us this pleasure in the midst of so much misery?" "There was no one better to be around when you wish to be convinced of something." Lawrence pressed a kiss to his lips, and Alexander felt the man's hand on his side, caressing him in a fluttering, frantic manner. "Yes, my Alexander, I want you. I want this." He wasted no time. He kissed Lawrence again, this time deeper, pressing his tongue into the other man's mouth. He had not felt so fantastically warm in weeks, and wondered if he would ever feel cold again. His hands reached for flesh, wishing desperately to tear clothes off. His fists clenched in the wool of Lawrence's jacket as Lawrence's hands dug into his shoulders. Finally he would have his way. He broke the kiss, swallowing a ragged little moan that made him dizzy. "I would make you moan so loudly, if there was privacy to be had," he mumbled against Lawrence's lips, tracing the man's hairline and drawing his fingers through his hair. "But we must be quiet for—" Yes, I know. And it is not acceptable for you to be telling anyone to be quiet, Hamilton." Lawrence nipped at his jawline, and the shock of it made his stomach twist. "How could you wound me at a time when we are so intimate?" Alexander retorted, gathering himself and kissing down Lawrence's neck. He could imagine those freckles at his throat. He could imagine that skin glistening with sweat, heaving with every breath. He even considered finding a candle, but it was too much effort. He could not move so far from his Lawrence. He was trapped in the man's orbit as surely as a moon. He bit there, first gently, listening to Lawrence's suppressed whimpers, then harder, and there were stifled moans, and he felt Lawrence shift around him. He reached, curious to know. He could feel the line of the man's arm reaching toward the other man's face. His hand. Lawrence was biting down on his hand to stop himself from moaning too loudly. Alexander's toes curled in his socks. He wrapped his legs around the other man until they were desperately flush. "You are a blasted scoundrel, Alexander Hamilton," Lawrence muttered to him. Alexander bit his throat again, this time harder still, and Lawrence gasped. "A blasted scoundrel who would ravish you all over at the slightest provocation," Alexander replied, and he planted his lips there and sucked. He would leave a mark. They would both know about it, hidden under a cravat. It would be their secret binding. If he were to die, let this mark remember him. "Just... Lord Alexander, how do you manage to be so thorough in all aspects of your life?" "There is no reason to set one's eyes upon a task if one cannot do it to the best of their abilities." He could feel Lawrence's eyes on him. He could sense the smile. He smiled back, breathless. Lawrence would know he was smiling. "I love you," he said. "I love you too," Lawrence replied.